Welcome everyone to week 9 of the tutorial series. Unfortunately, the audio was not working during the lecture, so I'm going to have to record this a bit after. So this week we're going to be learning about deployment and rendering strategies. So how does deployment work? Deployment essentially is the process of putting your application out there in the real world. And what that entails typically is you uploading a bunch of files to a computer up in the cloud. So if you're deploying a front end, you'll be putting HTML, CSS, JavaScript files on a server, and those files will be served over what's called a CDN. And those files can then be sort of downloaded when someone visits your URL, and then the browser sort of renders all that. For the back end, it's running code, so you're going to have to upload code files to a computer, and that computer will run that code continuously. And if it's a web server, when someone makes a HTTP request to that URL, typically they respond with some sort of response. So it's essentially allowing other computers to do what your computers is already doing when you're testing locally. So front end is typically easier to deploy. There are many reasons for this, but one of the major reasons is that front end is not actually code that's actually running. Front end is essentially just a bunch of static files. So you just upload these files to a computer, and then that computer sort of spreads it across multiple computers, and then serves it across the world. That's CDN. So it's very easy because you just have to deploy the files, and because of that, it's also typically cheaper. In fact, it's typically free if you're not getting a lot of traffic. So that's why front end is easier to deploy, because back end is actually code that's running, whereas front end is just a bunch of files to upload. So we're going to do, there's two platforms to deploy front end. One is Vercel, one is Netlify. They're very popular platforms that you could use to deploy your front end. But there are many other services out there, but these two are sort of the most popular, most user-friendly. Instead of using Vercel, I'm going to be using Netlify, but it doesn't really matter what you use. And the reason why I'm using Netlify is just because I need certain group permissions for the QWEB sort of tutorial. The repo. So looking at the repo right here, we have made some changes. So right now we have this thing called a .env. And so what this essentially is a package. I've installed the package .env, and I've required it. And what it essentially does is that when you're deploying certain things, you want certain variables to be a secret, right? So you want certain things to not be exposed when you push to GitHub. And for example, the database URL, if other people can have your database connection URL, they can connect to your database and do whatever they want with it, right? So that's not good. So because of that, we need to hide some things in the source code. Some things just can't be hard-coded. And so these things are typically stored in a .env file. These things are, by the way, they're called environment variables because they're variables that are stored in the environment of the current running machine and not in the source code itself. So right now we have a .env file in the server. Mongo URL equals to this connection string. And this is a very secretive value that no one can know. And I'm going to delete this database afterwards, so this will render, basically, it will render it obsolete. So that's how it all works. And so typically you want the lowest level thing to be deployed first. So we have here our the server, but the front end depends on the server, but the server depends on the database. So we should actually deploy the database first. So the best way to deploy a database is to actually use Mongo Atlas if you're using MongoDB, which we are. So MongoDB or Mongo Atlas is essentially a cloud service for MongoDB. It allows you to create databases on the cloud. So here we have a Mongo Atlas database. Contacts, contents, they're exactly the same. I've just simply imported the contents there. Now I've just created a database, and you could easily do that if you go into Mongo Atlas and just create a new cluster, and then inside that cluster you have a database. You can create a database. So I didn't show you that just because that involves entering some credentials. So if we look at the MongoDB Compass, we can actually connect to the cloud database and see that we have various databases here in this cluster, one of them being the CMS, which is our database that we want to connect to. And of course, I've got the connection URL, which is also something you can get here. And so we have the connection URL here. And so when we run, if we go to our terminal, in fact, the server is already running. So if the server is already running, we can go to a new tab and we can request the server contents. And we can see here that we actually do get a response, and this is data from the cloud database. So yeah, so it connects to the cloud database because we're requiring the .env file, and then we're using the process.env.mongo URL instead of just raw, hard coding the URL in here. So, but everything else is the same, right? Because the logic is all the same. So now that we have the MongoDB database deployed, we're going to deploy the server. So to deploy the server, so we're not going to actually deploy the front end. We're going to deploy the server. We're going to use Fly.io. So Fly.io is essentially a service that essentially, oh, not this kind of fly, is a service that allows you to ship containers. And the containers are essentially like sort of packaged apps, packaged by Docker, that sort of have a controlled environment for it to run. It's a bit complex, but it doesn't really matter. You don't have to really truly understand how it works under the hood. But it essentially allows you to deploy backend. It allows you to deploy running code. So, so yeah, just sign in to get started. I'm going to sign in with GitHub. And then now you see here that I have several things deployed, but from here we can actually launch an app. So before I do that, I have to make sure that everything works, which I already did. I had to make sure that everything works. And from here, I don't actually have to commit to the repo because it doesn't actually connect to the repo. But you can choose for it to connect to a repo. And here you can launch from GitHub, but I don't have the proper permissions from this organization, so I'm just going to do it locally from the terminal. So, but if you're doing it, I would highly recommend you use GitHub because it's just easier. So, okay. First, you have to install Fly on your local machine. I'm using Mac, so you use Homebrew, but I already did that. And then once you have access to the Fly command, you can use Fly launch to launch your app. So here we have the server. So I'm going to go in the server, in the CMS folder, in the server. So here we have our app, and we want to do Fly launch. What this will do is it will read locally all the files that you have, and then essentially deploy that. So Homebrew is doing its stuff, sort of updating the command, and then it will ask, it will have some default settings, and ask you, do you want to tweak these? I'm going to say no, and then it creates a Docker file and a Docker ignore. These are files that Docker needs to containerize your application. So if we look in the actual code, we can see here that we have a fly.toml, which is the configuration for the application, and we also have a Docker file, which is the sort of configuration for running the actual environment. So one of the most important things to keep note is these two. We exposed to port 3000, and we are indeed running on port 3000. And this is something that, of course, you can change, and this is something that they sort of deduced based on reading our code. And obviously we have an npm run start, which is something that I've also put in the package.json. I put a start script, which essentially just runs the app JS file with Node. So of course, this is something that you have to configure as well. But once you have, basically make your start script whatever is the starting point, and it will automatically configure. So if I go back to the terminal, it says here that it's deploying. So all this blue stuff is just Docker building the Docker image or the environment, and then it gets pushed to as a new machine. And then we have it deployed. So we have a new URL. So if we visit this URL, we can see here that the root URL has nothing, but if we do go to /contents, you can see here that probably takes a while. Oh, it doesn't work. The reason why is because it doesn't have the environment variables right here, right? So it doesn't actually upload this environment variable. So we have here success, false. But we know that the machine is actually working, or else we wouldn't get a response. So in here, this is our app, and you can of course name it whatever you want, but here we have the IP address, but we can go down to the secrets and then add a new secret here. The reason why we need to add this manually in is because this is a secret that is not hard-coded in the code itself, right? So we have a Mongo URL, and then we have the secret. So I'm going to copy this, paste that in here, and set it, and now we have the environment variable here. Of course, it says the secret is stage. You need to run fly deploy from the terminal. So I'm going to do that, fly deploy. And now it's going to redeploy, but now it has the actual environment variable set up. So it will redeploy with the actual environment variables loaded in the actual app. And so we just have to wait here. Probably takes a while. Wow, it's taking a while. Okay, so now that it's done, you can go back to the URL and go to /contents again, and now you can see here that because we have an environment variable loaded, it can actually then connect to the database safely. Okay, so now that we have this, we know that the backend URL is this, and so now we have to actually deploy the website. So the website is here. The website, remember, the website fetches from the backend using this script, and we can see here that I've extracted the backend URL to a separate variable, so I can change it easier. And the backend URL is not a secret because they can actually see that, obviously, because anyone can just fetch it from here. Your front end is really just a wrapper around this data. And so we know that a backend URL is this, so I'm going to paste it in here, and then we're going to use the backend URL whenever we want to fetch content. So if we, for example, open up this website, which is here, and refresh, and let's see here, doesn't seem to work. If we go to the console, it says cannot fetch. Oh, right, we need a HTTPS, obviously, to make it a URL. Okay, now that it works, so now it fetches the data here and fetches the data from here as well. So we know that the backend works, and we know that the front end is fetching from the right backend. Now we can deploy this website. So I'm going to go on Netlify, and on Netlify, I'm going to create a new site. I'm going to maybe deploy manually, and you can just literally just drag drop the front end files, right? And so I'm just gonna do that just because it's easier, or I can use the repo, and I'm gonna do that actually. And if I'm gonna use the repo, I'm gonna have to push. So I'm gonna git add, sorry, this is just a tool to forget. So git add, git commit, and I can do ready for deployment. I'm gonna push to the actual repo, and then I'm gonna import from existing project, use GitHub, and I'm gonna use the QWEB organization, education 25, the site name, doesn't matter, education 25 John Borg maybe, and that definitely is available. And we're gonna deploy on branch week 9, and base directory should be the website. So I'm gonna do website / there's no build command, it's just already a static file. Publish directory is indeed the website, and make sure, by the way, that the HTML that you want to be initialized is called index.html. And then there's no environment variables because it's just hard-coded here. And then we can deploy the website. So that'll probably take a while as it connects to the actual repo. But while that's happening, just a reminder, we also have a dashboard. And this dashboard connects to the backend and allows you to change the content. So we can see here that in here, we have the React code, and in the source, we have the actual component of the app. So we can see here that I'm using an environment variable, but again, this is also not secret. Everything on the front end is exposed, which is fine because it's just the backend URL. And this is stored in .env file. And Vite supports .env files out of the box, so you don't need to do that .env package thing. So you can just use this. This is all in the docs, by the way. And then you can see here that I'm using Vite backend URL as the localhost 3000. And of course, I'm going to change this to the actual URL of the backend that we deployed. So that's in the script file. And I'm going to copy this. Yeah, so no slash. Save that. And then if we do that, if we refresh, just to restart the server, just in case. Okay, and so let's just look at our site. Okay, our site is deployed. If we go on the actual URL, you can see here that we have it deployed. This is a public URL, and of course we have here the website and of course the content. So the currently the dashboard connects to the backend because we have it in the environment variable. So if I do change the description and it actually updates, and I go here and refresh, you can see here that we have a changed description. So that's pretty cool, but we want to deploy this dashboard as well, right? And this dashboard, instead of being raw HTML, CSS, JS, we have some JSX, which is not supported in the browser, obviously. And so to solve that, we do npm run build, and what that essentially does is it analyzes the code that you wrote in JSX, in React, and it sort of packages them and builds them into regular HTML and JavaScript and CSS files, which is something that you can actually deploy. So that's how the process works. So to do that, we're going to go to Netlify, and we're going to deploy a new site because it's, again, a front end, right? So deploy, import from existing project, GitHub, going to point to the same repo, education 25, and then now we see here that we need a site name, so we're going to do education 25 dashboard, and then we can use the week 9 deploy. The base directory would actually be cms dash or slash dashboard, and then we just saw that the build command is npm run build, which builds the static files, and then the published directory should be cms/dashboard/dist. As you can see here, it's cms/dashboard/dist. That's the URL that we should serve. So and we could also add an environment variable, and of course this is not secret. I can put it in here, and then once that's added, we can go ahead and deploy. So that will probably take a while. So again, just to recap, we have deployed from the local computer, laptop. We have deployed the backend, which runs the code and actually connects to the database. We have deployed the website, which fetches from this backend, which obviously then fetches from the database. And then we have the dashboard that we're currently deploying that allows us to change the content from the database via the backend. So now that it's deployed, we can open the production deploy, and you can see here that it works. We can see here that we have the change description from the deployment. If I update that, refresh here, you can see here that it updates. So in fact, if we actually add a new query in the database, so whatever, submit, it fetches it makes a post request to the backend, which then changes the database, which allows us to see it from here if we refresh. So that's essentially how you would deploy it. Now, of course, this is just a demo. You can see here that this is not very secure because this dashboard allows us to change the content, but it's completely open to the public. So anyone can just go to the URL and change the content. Now you would think that the way you would secure that is to actually put a password on the front end, but that is not safe either because they can actually just change the state of the front end, and then just allow us to access. And even then, like they can still go and make post requests with Postman to our backend URL, right? So whenever you want to make things secure and only have certain things be authorized by, or have certain data be secure, and only have a certain people have the authorization to change it, you have to do it in the back end. And so don't secure your things on the front end. It doesn't work. Okay, so now that that's deployed, so we now get a rough concept of how deployment works. If it's the front end, you use something like Vercel or Netlify, you upload the static files. If you're using React, you have to build it and then serve it. If you're using something like Netlify, or sorry, using something like Vercel, if you use something like Vercel, you literally point to the repo that has the V project and it will literally do everything for you. Same thing with Next.js, but just know that that's what's happening under the hood. So yeah, we have the database, backend, and then two front ends. So okay, so that's it with deployment. And right now we can talk about rendering strategies. So there are various ways a website could render the actual content. And the reason I'm talking about this week is because it kind of relates to how we deploy it. So the most simple way is just raw HTML, CSS, JavaScript. So this is on the front end, right? So you have a bunch of files, you push it onto a web server, and then the web server makes, or the browser, your user's browser, makes HTTP requests to the web server. By the way, the web server is associated with the IP address, and that IP address is also associated with a URL via the DNS. So, but anyway, so they make a request to your server, and then the server responds with these files, and then the browser renders HTML, CSS, and runs JavaScript. That's very simple. Another way is static site generation. So this is instead of writing raw HTML, CSS, JavaScript, you get to write more fancy like code. So for example, you can write React code, but you can build that React code into just raw HTML, CSS, JavaScript. Not exactly like how we just did. What we just did is essentially building a typical React app. What static site generation does is it actually creates the whole HTML. Whereas in here, we actually just have a template HTML, which React then hooks into, React being this JavaScript file, hooks into, and then actually pushes all those HTML elements inside. Static site generation is actually generating the HTML file. The reason why this is good is because it increases or it improves load times because the HTML is already ready, and so the browser doesn't actually run the JavaScript. But also it also improves SEO because the HTML is already pre-rendered. But you get the benefit of actually writing React code, which actually allows you to write the whole website in components. There's also client-side rendering, CSR, which is a typical React app, which actually which is basically what we just did. So it builds into a shell of an HTML, and then that shell of an HTML have a div that the JavaScript will then hook into, and then that JavaScript will then run and load all that element as in the browser, in your client's browser. So this increases interactivity because JavaScript takes over the whole HTML, so there's more interactivity, but at the same time you sacrifice a bit of performance because you have to actually send over the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and then have the browser run the JavaScript for the user to actually see the content. So here we have server-side rendering, which is different. Instead of having just a shell of an HTML, and instead of just static HTML, we have dynamic HTML, so every request can be different, but when a user requests a site, it sends with it some data, and the HTML then takes this data and then fills in an HTML template based off of that data. So the server actually has a template, and it just sort of fills in the gap based on what the user requests, or fills in the gap based on what the state of the database, and then returns raw HTML. But that raw HTML is generated on request time. And so that's server-side rendering because it's rendering on the server. Whereas here we're rendering on the client side, which is the browser. And But now with more fancy tools, we can actually have a best of both worlds with both server-side rendering and client-side rendering. And the term is a bit confusing here because most people would consider server-side rendering as part of this hydration hybrid process. But traditionally, server-side rendering is sort of just having a template of an HTML and then filling that in on request time. But right now, it's sort of synonymous with actually building the hybrid approach. So the hybrid approach is essentially is a request at request time. It builds the HTML and it gives you that HTML, but it also gives you JavaScript, and this JavaScript allows the whole website to be interactive after the fact, and that interactivity that's added later on is called hydration. So it sends you raw HTML, but then the JavaScript hydrates. And so I'm not sure why it's called hydration, but whatever. And then now with the last rendering strategy, there's a lot more, but incremental static regeneration. So this allows you to it's essentially SSG, except instead of building it once, you build it incrementally. So instead of building it once and it's just a static site that will stay the same forever, ISR sort of allows you to build the site once and then deploy it, and then at a set interval, it rebuilds with fresh data. So it refetches from the database and creates the new HTML and then redeploys it. And of course, the interval you can set. And this is, by the way, kind of overkill. If you want to mess with that, just use something like server-side rendering. But this does save database reads because you only rebuild every once in a while rather than every single request. And it keeps the data fresh, whereas with SSG and static HTML files, they are the same all the time. So that's essentially how ISR works. But for the most part, just understand these concepts. You don't have to actually use ISR, but it's definitely useful to actually understand SSG, CSR, SSR, and hydration. These are very, very important concepts to understand. So yeah, that's pretty much it for deployments, and yeah, thanks for watching.